Hello. Today we want to talk about, in this lesson, how to plan your class for the year. This is particularly designed for new teachers, but there may be some hints here that experienced teachers may learn as well. What we're looking at is planning out your class for the year so that you will use your time and use your class lessons most effectively. Now, I want you to think about just about every history class you've ever had as an example of this, especially in middle school and high school. Okay, take U.S. history as an example. Okay, what generally happened? Okay, you probably spent in U.S. history a lot of time learning about the early explorers of North America. Then you learned about the early colonies, the build-up to the War for Independence, and you spent a lot of time on the War for Independence. You learned about the Constitution and other things around that. Then you kept on moving through history. You got to the war between the states. You spent a lot of time on that. And the year is getting on to an end, and it's getting close to the end of the year, so you probably managed to get to World War I and to the Great Depression. Okay, then it's coming to the last few days of class, so you race through World War II, you have the Korean War, you have the 60s, and maybe you spent about a half hour of the last class on history after the 60s. You might have heard of the Vietnam War, but you really don't know anything about it. You don't know much about LBJ or Watergate, Gerald Ford's golf game, or Jimmy Carter being attacked by a killer rabbit. Okay, you spent so much time on the early years of the country that you could only look in a brief way at anything after about 1925. And you probably think that U.S. history ended about 1925. And this is probably the way all your history classes were. And in fact, one history teacher tried going backwards through U.S. history for this very reason. He started with 20th century history and then went backwards, showing how current events flowed out of previous events, tracing things back to the beginning, but at least that made sure he actually talked about the 20th century. Now, I'm not faulting history teachers here. Don't hear me saying that. But I'm pointing out that you want to be careful, whether you're a history teacher or any other teacher, you want to think, now how can I be sure that I cover all the material I want to cover? And that I don't get to the end of the year and have to try to cram 2 centuries worth of history into 2 hours, or half of my trigonometry text into 1 week. Some thoughts about planning will help on this. This is especially important if it's your first time teaching or if it's the first time you've taught a particular subject. After you've taught something for a few years, you have a better feel about pacing for the class. So now, let's think about planning for the year. Okay, you want to get the big picture in mind first of how the year is divided. So a full school year in a traditional school setting is about 34 weeks of classes. Now we're talking about a high school level here, so you have 36 weeks of classes technically, but 2 of those weeks are exam weeks, so you can't count those for planning lessons. So you have about 34 weeks of classes in the year. Then the year is divided into 2 semesters of about 17 weeks each, again not counting the exam week that comes at the end of each semester. Then you have each semester divided into 2 quarters that might be 9 or 8 weeks long. The difference again is because of the exam week in the 2nd and 4th quarters. Now, as you think about this, this helps you to start seeing how the year is going to flow. But remember, this is just a rough guideline. Every school has special days or activities that cut into the teaching time. Okay, you have a day for student pictures, you've got Spirit Week, you have field trips. So you can't really look at this and say, okay, first quarter, I have 9 weeks and 5 days in each week, so I've got 45 teaching days. You actually don't. We'll talk later about mapping out daily pacing, but here we're just looking at the big picture. So let's think about our planning on each of these levels. First, think about planning for the full year. And remember that this is going to depend somewhat on your subject. For example, math is generally laid out very specifically to follow this pattern. Many math books have 12 units. So you cover 6 units each semester, 3 units a quarter, spending about 3 weeks on each unit. That breaks down very easily, and the lessons in math books generally are designed for a single day, that is a traditional length class period of about 50 to 55 minutes. Or they might be designed so that you have a day of teaching and a day of review occasionally. So math is pretty easy to map out for the year. On the other end of the spectrum are things like Bible classes that don't usually fall into such neat scheduling packages. In Bible, you've got to do a lot more planning. And again, math classes too are dependent on, they're rather inflexible in pacing. Okay, you can plan ahead and you get to the end of the unit, you got to have a test. Okay, you can't really add more lessons easily or take a lesson out easily. You think, okay, I've got to have a test at the end of this unit before I begin the next unit. I can't really move that test date around a whole lot. In Bible, if you need to, you can shift the ending date of your unit to some degree, expand the lecture material or cut it to some degree, or you can compress it. So you have more flexibility in some of the other subjects. So our planning is going to depend on the subject. But the idea here is you want to get the big picture of where you're going through the year. So look at the textbook, look at your curriculum guides, see what the overall scope of your course is. Again, in subjects like math, it's pretty much given to you, while other subjects allow you more flexibility. For example, if you're teaching ancient history, when do you begin? What's the time period where you begin? And how far in history you're expected to get to the end of the year? If students are going to have modern history next year, where is that teacher going to pick up so you know how far you've got to go? If you're supposed to get to the Renaissance, for example, then you think, okay, I've got to cover history from creation to the Renaissance. Then you think about the major units of study that you're going to have. What are the things that you're going to focus on? The big picture items again. If I were teaching music history, for example, I would have a unit on the beginnings of music and scripture. There would be a major unit of study on pre-Renaissance music, then Renaissance music, the Reformation. I would have units on the Baroque, on Classic, on Romantic, on Impressionist, and 20th century. I mean, those would be my major topics. That way I think, okay, I'm covering all the important issues in music history. Then you think about the relative emphasis you want to give to each of these units. For example, in music history, I know that the unit on pre-Renaissance music is not going to take a long time, but I'm going to hit really hard on the Baroque and Classic and Romantic eras because those are the times that have seen the most development in music. So I'll think, okay, my unit on pre-Renaissance music might not be as long, but I need to be sure and allow plenty of time for Baroque and Classic and Romantic. So you'll look at this in your own subject area and decide which units are the really big ones where you're going to need a bit more time and which units, while you need to study them, are not going to take as long. So that's how you kind of map out and think about what you're going to do for the year. Kind of plan that out. You jot down notes and say, okay, here are the major things I need to cover. Then you start thinking about the semesters after you break this down. Okay, now the way most high schools work, the semester break is an important break. You have an exam at the end of the first semester that covers all the material from the semester. You have grades are recorded for each semester separately. You've got a major vacation there in the middle at Christmas. So you want to try to have a major unit break at the semester break. So the material before the break comes to a conclusion, then you pick up with something new after the break. For example, in my Old Testament class, the major units of study that I have for the year are the Pentateuch, that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Then I have the historical books of the Old Testament, the prophets, and the wisdom literature, 4 major units. Now there's a natural break between the study of the historical books and the study of the prophets. So I plan for that break to fall at the semester break. I try not to start something new before the semester break and carry it across the break. Sometimes that's unavoidable. You may not be able to avoid that, but you want to plan at least that here's where the semester break is going to come, and if possible, I want to try for that to be a division between units, and I can start something fresh in the second semester. Now, as mentioned, the semester is about 17 weeks of class, give or take a little. Remember, special days each at that time. You have the first few days of class are handled differently, and you plan for some review at the end of the semester. You have fun days during the semester, but you've got about 17 weeks to plan for. So within your semesters, then, set your priorities like you did for the year. For example, in my Old Testament, if I'm going to cover the Pentateuch and the historical books in the first semester, am I going to spend an equal amount of time on each of those? I could just say, okay, a quarter on the Pentateuch, a quarter on the historical books. But you could also say, well, the Pentateuch is so foundational to all the Bible that I'm going to spend a bit more time on it than on the historical books. Or I could say, I've got a lot of stuff to cover in the historical books, so I'm going to need to spend more time on them than on the Pentateuch. So look at your priorities there and see how you want to allocate your time. Just kind of get some rough sketches. You might say, okay, out of 17 weeks, I'm going to spend 8 weeks on the Pentateuch, and I'm going to spend 9 weeks on the historical books, or something like that. You kind of break that out in a big picture. Again, that's what we're talking about here right now, is the big picture items. So you've planned for the semesters. Now you break things down by quarters. Okay, the divisions between first and second quarter and third and fourth quarter are not as significant as the semester break, so you might have a unit that goes across those quarters. It's not a big deal if you start something at the end of the first quarter and finish it in the first few weeks of the second quarter. You might not necessarily have a test right at the end of the first quarter. You might not be at the point for a test at that point. The quarter divisions kind of give you help as far as keeping you on pace. You think, okay, I should be about halfway through my first semester's work at the end of the first quarter. Now, having said that, though, you do have to plan for grades now. You give grades for the quarters. Those are what come out on the report cards at the end of every 9 weeks. And you need to have enough graded work so that grade is accurate and reflective of the student's work. If a student's had only one test and one quiz in the first quarter, and the student happens to bomb that one quiz, his quarter grade is going to be hit really hard, and it doesn't reflect his learning. So plan things out so that you're going to have several graded items each quarter. In our school, the policy is that a single graded assignment, any one assignment, cannot count more than 25% of the quarter's grade. So maybe you set up your grading system so that tests count 25% of the grade, quizzes 25%, homework 25%, and participation 25%. I'm not advocating that, I'm just using that as an easy example. But let's say you get to the end of the quarter and you haven't given any quizzes, you've given one test. Now if you look at the percentages where you have 25, 25, 25, 25, and there's no quizzes, all of a sudden that one test is a third of the quarter's grade. It's 33% rather than 25%, and you violated our policy. So you want to give enough thought to the graded work you assign during the quarter so that you see that you're going to have enough grades to have an accurate grade. Also, plan for any major projects you're going to assign. If you have a research paper, if you want them to do that, think about when that's going to come in the quarter. So it will be after you've taught the material they need, but also taking into account other teachers. You don't want the students to have 3 research papers all due the same week. So think about that. Plan for when your major projects are going to come due. And that brings up the next point, is to collaborate in your planning. First, talk with other teachers of your subject. If the school has other teachers in your subject area, talk with other teachers. If you're teaching Bible and you've got another Bible teacher, get input from him about pacing and how quickly you can expect to progress and so on. Maybe he can say, you're not going to be able to cover the Pentateuch in a week. So he can give you some input there. Run your pacing by him to make sure you're not leaving something out or moving too quickly. If you're teaching music history and you haven't said anything about the Baroque, another teacher may say, that's a pretty big deal. You probably ought to look at that. So talk with other teachers of your subject. And then coordinate with other teachers, all the other teachers in your area, in the school. Like I said, students should not have several major papers or projects due at the same time. If you're going to have a research paper in Bible, talk with the English and history teachers to see if they also have major papers due, so that you can avoid that time. Or maybe you put your research paper to another quarter when they're not going to have papers. So check with other teachers about other major projects. Maybe a teacher has a big PowerPoint presentation he expects from the students. Just coordinate this so your students are not going to be overloaded. Also, in our school, we have a test calendar. Many schools have this. Ours is online, and teachers are to post all the tests and projects and other major assignments. We'll talk about that in another session as far as the details. Don't post daily homework and minor quizzes here, but just the big items. If you want to plan for a test or a project, you need to look at that calendar first. And our policy here is that students are not to have more than 2 tests or major assignments due on the same day. So if you look on there, if you're teaching freshmen, for example, and you look on the test calendar and you want to give a test on Friday and you see that they already have tests in 2 other subjects that the freshmen do, then you're going to need to find another date for your test. Or you need to talk to those other 2 teachers to see, well, maybe you can cooperate and one of them can move. Again, we'll talk more about the test calendar during teacher orientation, but for now the point is to realize that you have to coordinate major projects with other teachers. Now, you should give some thought as to how your lessons are going to be. Each quarter
is 8 or 9 weeks long, so you can take your quarterly work and think about how it will fall on a week-by-week basis. For example, as I plan the Old Testament survey class, I look at this and I think, okay, I want to have covered an introduction to the Old Testament and a discussion of the inspiration of Scripture at the end of the first week. By the end of the 3rd week, I want to have finished the book of Genesis. So you kind of look through, and again, this is not the daily lesson plans, but this is where you start thinking, okay, how is this going to pace through the quarter? Now I realize that especially when you get down to this weekly planning, it's going to be tentative the first time you teach a course. You don't know what issues or topics are going to be easy for the students and which ones are going to take more time. So you get into the book of Genesis and you might realize, hey, I can't cover this in the first 3 weeks. So be flexible with that. However, even though you're being tentative about it, this is going to help you to keep the big picture in mind. You think about what else you have to cover during the year. As you're pacing through, as you're teaching the class then, if you spend more time on Genesis than you planned, okay, it's in week 4 or 5 and you're still on Genesis, you realize, okay, I'm going to have to cut something later so I can get through the entire Old Testament. If you're not getting through with Genesis when you planned, maybe you've gone into too much detail and you need to cut back a little. Again, in a math class, for example, this is pretty well mapped out by the textbook. But courses in the humanities, that is English, history, and Bible, are easy to get off schedule, and that's where you end up trying to cover 2 centuries in 1 hour. If you've mapped out what you need to cover from the year on down, it'll help you stay on track. It won't prevent you from getting off, but at least it will give you a roadmap to keep your destination in mind. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to contact me at the email address on the screen. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to other sessions with you. Thank you for listening.